welcome to the second episode of Food for Your Mind. Today we're up to the Wendy's Double and the Corrections by Jonathan Franzen. Now, obviously we did the single last week, now we're up to the double. This is twice as much meat. Well, this is certainly meaty indeed. Of course, our books are getting a little meatier too. Last week we had lowbrow, now we're up to more like middle brow. So, you know, hey, that's a big change, right? See, meat is not really the premier element in the fast food burger. And I feel like this is showcasing the wrong thing in a way. I can't manage to eat it, as you can see. Alright, I think maybe that's good. I'm not going to quite finish it. Maybe that's cheating, maybe it's not. Tell me what you think. Yeah, I have to say, unfortunately, I don't think I like this quite as much as the single. I'm going to give this a reduced score. I'm going to give it a 4 out of 10. So, not that great for the double. Okay, well, let's move on to the Corrections by one Jonathan Franzen. First, a little bit of biographical data, just a very little bit. Jonathan Franzen was born on August 17th, 1959 in Western Springs, Illinois. He went to Swarthmore for college, where he was a German major. I did want to mention probably the most famous thing about Jonathan Franzen. You can see right here, the Corrections does still have the Oprah's Book Club sticker on it. So despite the fact that he said he thought the Oprah's Book Club sucked, or whatever it was he said, I'm paraphrasing his comment. But yeah, in spite of that, the sticker remains. And I am not the biggest fan of Oprah Winfrey, just incidentally, but I felt like she was totally within her rights to say, no, I don't want you on my show after you said my book club sucked. That's fine. I think that's probably what I would have done too if I were Oprah. Just as I made the claim that The Shining was kind of a representation of the hell that is working class life in America, this book is about the middle class and what middle class people are like, what their lives are like. So as you see, we're moving up in terms of class, in terms of number of patties, and in fact in terms of literary ability, I would say. Jonathan Franzen is a better writer than Stephen King, though this is not a better book than The Shining, I would say. In fact, I would say it's actually a slightly worse book because the story isn't as interesting and the characters aren't as interesting. We'll go over all that in due time, so don't worry. Let's talk about these middle class people for a moment. People who are in the middle of American society. What are they like? More importantly, what are their values like? What are middle class values? I remember when I was in college, a long time ago, I was taking an African American studies class, and my professor made the claim that when you're considering black people who are living in poverty, living in very bad environments, that the difference between the people who were able to navigate that environment and still have somewhat successful lives, as opposed to those who weren't. The ones who were able to navigate that environment had what he called middle class values. Say that again, middle class values. And it struck me that that's actually a fairly insulting thing to say to lower class people, basically. The secret, the way out of your situation, is to be more like these other people. It seems a bit of a simplification, shall we say. Now, I began to think, you know, how is that true? Do middle class people have, on the balance, different values from working class people? And I actually think that my professor was right, and that middle class people and working class people do have somewhat different values. However, unlike him, I believe that it is these middle class values that need to go. And I think that's actually what Jonathan Franzen thinks too. He doesn't quite come out and say that in this book, but that was one of the things that I took away from it. So again, middle class people, people who, they're not rich, they're not poor, they're right in the middle. You've met people like this before. What are they like? What are they like? Well, let's start with the name of the family. They're the Lamberts in this novel. Obviously, Lamberts, lamb. That is exactly what middle class people are like. They're herd animals in a way. They're people who go along to get along. They're people who seem a bit vacant sometimes in terms of their personality. Sometimes you meet a middle class dude and you kind of wonder if you've actually met somebody or not. Another thing that I've often kind of thought about middle-class people, they seem a bit like people who are lost in a desert. Only they don't know that they're in the desert because they've always been in the desert. I don't know if that's going to make any sense to anybody else, but that is kind of my impression, so take it for what you will. In a way, I guess that's kind of what you'd expect middle-class people's personalities to be like. People who are on the extremes of the income scale, people who are very poor, people who are very rich, you might kind of expect to have more extreme personalities. And people who are in the middle tend to have kind of more mid-length personalities. I would also like to say that for most of my life, I believed that the reason middle-class people didn't have much personality was because of some kind of character flaw on their part. Now I actually don't think that's true. I think the reason that middle-class people don't have much personality is because they have to work so hard, they're under so much pressure, that they never get a chance to build one. They never get a chance to make that happen for themselves. You always want to consider your own prejudices when you're reading a book or when you're doing anything. I can tell you that, for example, I would never have read this book except to talk about it for the show. And the reason that I would never have read this book was because I knew it was about the struggles of middle-class life in America. And that was all I needed to know that I didn't care about it. Growing up, I was a more lower-class guy, but who mostly had more middle-class friends. Had a fair number of working-class friends, too. But always had more than 50% middle-class friends, I would say. I wasn't always entirely fair with those people. The way I justified that to myself was I could always think to myself, well, you know what, he's going to be fine, and he doesn't have any real problems as compared to me. So, you know, if this situation turned out to favor me a bit, well, so what? And back then, in my heart of hearts, I kind of, at least a part of me, you know, just wanted to see all these people's heads on spikes somewhere. Time went on, and certainly through nothing that I did, but mostly for my wife, I one day entered the middle class, and it is one of the strangest things that can happen to you in your life to wake up and realize that you have become the enemy. I'd like to talk about what as I mentioned, I didn't really like this book very much. I don't think I liked it as much as The Shining even. And the main reason I didn't like it was that none of these characters are cool. One of the characters, Gary, actually gives a rebuttal to this point. He says, well, what, does everybody have to be cool? Somebody has to be uncool for somebody to be cool, after all. It's a fair point, but still, when you're consuming artwork, you want at least one of the characters to be a little bit cool, or you want something cool to happen to one of them. Jack Torrance in The Shining is fair to say is cool. I found him to be a kind of a cool guy, you know? He's working in this haunted hotel, whatever. But not so for any of these characters. I guess maybe the takeaway from that is there are very few things that you can't buy in America. One of the things you still can't quite buy is cool. You know, you can buy cool clothes and you can buy cool music, but you still can't buy a personality. I'd like to start talking about some of the characters in this novel. Almost the entirety of the cast is made up of the Lambert family, with patriarch Alfred, who is dying of Parkinson's. He is my favorite character in this book. I felt genuine pity for him in the descriptions of the way his body feels throughout this breakdown. It was well written, and that's a very hard thing to do well, is to describe disease and bodily discomfort. I'd like to mention another writer named Stanley Elkin, just briefly. He had multiple sclerosis in real life, and he wrote about this in a book called The Franchiser. So check that out if you ever get a chance. It's at this point that I'm going to give you my program, where I'm calling the 420 solution for all the characters in this novel. Now, you may be asking yourself, Henry, are you being serious about this? Is this serious literary criticism? Well, I don't know, but I can only give you my honest reaction to this book. And this was a reaction that I had never had while reading any book I've ever read before, and I've read thousands. And that reaction was, every character in this novel just needs to start smoking weed. And most of their problems would be fixed. Just to start with Alfred. I'm not a scientist myself, but my understanding is there is some research that suggests that marijuana is actually good for people with Parkinson's and can in fact prevent Parkinson's. So Alfred clearly needs to start. Let's move on to his wife Enid. Enid is now Alfred's caretaker, more or less, caregiver, I should say, during his decline. And though she's a transplant to the middle class, we're told she grew up fairly poor, she has middle class values in the extreme. And we're going to read a passage now to demonstrate that. So this is Enid's description of Enid's kind of interior monologue. But at a Saturday wedding in the lilac season from a pew of the Paradise Valley Presbyterian Church, she could look around and see 200 nice people and not a single bad one. All her friends were nice and had nice friends. And since nice people tended to raise nice children, Enid's world was like a lawn in which the blue grass grew so thick that evil was simply choked out. A miracle of niceness. Enid goes on to talk for a bit about weddings, and the kind of weddings that she likes, and eventually she gets down to the type of wedding that she doesn't so much like. Let's listen to that. Sometimes, at a wedding hosted by less good friends of Enid's, the bride would be heavier or significantly older than the groom, or the groom's family would hail from a farm town upstate and be obviously overawed by Dietmeier's elegance. Enid felt sorry for the principals at a reception like that. She just knew the marriage was going to be a struggle from day one. This is a supremely middle-class thing. And I wrote it down because I felt I had put this in very good terms. Is concern regarding the lives and opinions of other people. No one cares more about what other people think of them and what other people are doing with their lives than middle-class people. Most working-class people don't give a damn what you think about them and don't give a damn what you're doing either. And I was trying to figure out why that might be true, and this is what I came up with. Do you remember how I said earlier, middle-class people sometimes seem like they're kind of lost in the desert? I think that when you're out in that desert, out in the middle-class desert, the only signposts you have to tell you that you're even anywhere are other people and your position relative to them. Consider the point that Enid made about disliking it when the bride was physically heavier than the groom. Think about the marriages you know in which that is the case. Is that more common among middle-class people or lower-class people? Obviously, that's much more common among lower-class people. Enid, it seems to me, could stand to start smoking weed too, namely because she started taking Aslan, this prescription thing, out on this cruise ship. I actually just wanted to give you a description of what Aslan feels like. Okay, so she's just taking the pill here. For a few minutes, she brushed and flossed, a bit of oral housekeeping to pass the time. Then, with a shudder of cresting exhaustion, she went to her bed to lie in wait. Golden sunlight fell across the blankets in her windowless room. He nuzzled her palm with his warm velvet snout. He licked her eyelids with a tongue both sandpapery and slick. His breath was sweet and gingery. When she came awake, the cool halogen lighting in the stateroom wasn't artificial anymore. It was the cool light of sun from behind a momentary cloud. Aslan is named for the lion in the Chronicles of Narnia, by the way. I thought that was kind of funny. That's the closest thing to a joke in this whole book. There's a curious little quote towards the end of the book. Edith eventually gets some Aslan at home. A friend brings it to her. And she's considering taking it, and she says, "No, I don't want this. I want the real thing. I want my family together at Christmas." I got news for you, Enid. Down in the working class, you can take drugs and be with your family. Enid's actually a pretty good character, too. The three kids, I'm sorry to say, are all more boring. I guess that's the main reason I didn't like this book more than I did, is I thought that all three children of the family, I don't know, again, uncool. There's Gary, who's kind of a depressed, alcoholic banker. Again, medical studies have shown marijuana to have more slight health impacts as compared to alcohol. God, Gary, if you can just get yourself down to one drink on a weekday, just cut it off at one, you'll be doing better. There's Chip, the kind of, I guess he's supposed to be the cooler, younger son, the protagonist of the novel. He's also drinking too much. He actually mentions marijuana briefly. He says it keeps him up at night. Chip, I'd smoke it anyway, buddy. I also wanted to mention, regarding Chip and this novel in general, There's a lot of sex. There's lots and lots and lots of sex in contemporary fiction generally. And if you go to any literary reading ever, I mean, don't, but just if you did, you would see that most of what people are writing about is sex. And I'm not really sure why. Sometimes I think that what writers are trying to do when they're doing this is convince the audience that they have had sex or are somehow sexy. That did not really succeed in this case, I wouldn't say. Even Denise, who is the most interesting of the three children, when she is at a certain point having a bisexual love triangle with a married couple, even that you would think, hell, this has to be at least kind of interesting. But what happens to me, and I can turn around so that you can see it, is you'll be reading this lesbian scene here, and you can sort of through the pages, you can still see Jonathan Franzen's face just sort of peeking out at you from around the corner. And I just kind of, I don't know, it doesn't quite do it for me somehow. But Denise is pretty boring too. She doesn't maybe need to smoke weed, but her lesbian lover, Robin Passifaro, or Passifaro, I guess is how you say it, she is doing this community garden to help these ghetto youth, learn the value of turnips or whatever. And apparently she says, only 5% of the local teens are going to come grow turnips inside of these old tires. I have to worry about the 95% that aren't going to come. Here's the thought, Robin. How about you start growing weed at this place? Then you get the 95% instead of the 5%. See what I'm saying? I did want to mention the working class characters in the novel, because there are a couple. There's Don R. Moore, who Denise bones once in her younger days, and then I think never sees again. There's also Kelye Withers. Great name, by the way. Hard to tell what race he might be based on that. I guess we'll just have to guess or imagine. He is mentioned because he is the murderer of the daughter of a woman named Sylvia Roth, who Enid meets on the cruise ship. And I would like to read a passage describing Sylvia's feelings about young Kelye. Again, this man murders her daughter. And so she finally told herself the truth. She wanted Kelye Withers dead. She wanted him dead despite her recent interview with the Philadelphia Inquirer, in which she'd avowed that killing someone else's child wouldn't bring back her own. She wanted him dead despite the religious fervor with which her MD PhD had forbid her to interpret Jordan's death religiously. For example, as a divine judgment on her own liberal politics or liberal parenting or senseless affluence. She wanted him dead despite believing that Jordan's death had been a random tragedy and that redemption lay not in vengeance but in reducing the incidence of random tragedies nationwide. She wanted him dead despite imagining a society that provided jobs at a decent wage for young men like him so that he would not have had to bind the wrists and ankles of his former art therapist and bully out of her the passwords for her bank card and credit cards. A society that staunched the flow of illegal drugs into urban neighborhoods so that Withers could not have spent the stolen money on crack and would have had more mental clarity when he returned to the apartment of his former art therapist and would not have proceeded to smoke the rock and torture her on and off for 30 hours. Again, we see here even Kelye. Perhaps if he had been smoking weed instead of crack, fewer people may have been tortured and murdered. So that's another point in favor of my argument here. There's a third and final working class character who plays a pretty significant role in the novel. That is Billy Passifaro. That's Robin Passifaro's adopted brother. Adopted from the working class. It's made clear in a number of ways. Anyway, Billy Passifaro becomes a pretty bad dude, and here's a description of something he eventually does. Billy Passifaro, neatly shaved and wearing a short-sleeved white button-down, carried a 4-foot length of 2x4 on which he'd written "Welcome to Philadelphia," with two exclamation points there. When the official ceremonies ended and the scene became more appealingly anarchic, Billy edged into the crowd, smiling and holding aloft his message of goodwill, until he was close enough to the dignitaries that he could swing the 2x4 like a baseball bat and break Rip Flamberg's skull. 3 further blows demolished Flamberg's nose, jaw, collarbone, and most of his teeth before the mayor's bodyguard tackled Billy and a dozen cops piled on. Billy was lucky the tent was too crowded for the cops to shoot him. He was also lucky given the obvious premeditation of his crime and the politically awkward shortage of white inmates on death row that Rick Flamberg didn't die. Less clear was whether Flamberg himself, an unmarried Dartmouth grad whom the attack left palsied, disfigured, slurred of speech, blind in one eye, and prone to incapacitating headaches, felt lucky about this. And Rick Flamberg is, of course, revealed to be a technocrat who is trying to ruin the lives of local school children, etc. I mentioned earlier that no one does anything cool in this novel. This is the coolest thing that anyone does, is when Billy Pacifero beats the hell out of this guy with the 2x4 that says "Welcome to Philadelphia" on it. I thought for a fairly long time about how I felt that this was how this novel portrayed working class people. And I finally concluded that, given the choice between being a sassy maid and the hammer of the gods, I'd rather be the hammer of the gods. Well, I'm afraid that is it, except for, of course, final review. You know, it's a middle-brow novel about the middle class. I think it's only appropriate that it gets a 5.